Welcome to our Summer 2020 Innovation Business and Law Center speaker series on COVID-19 and innovation policy. Each week we have a short talk by one of our series speakers, followed by some time for questions. You can type questions into the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar, or you can type them into chat. And just as a reminder, this program is being recorded. So with that, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Professor Lisa Larrimore Ouellette. Professor Ouellette is an associate professor of law at Stanford Law School and the Justin M. Roach Jr. faculty scholar. She's also an intellectual property law superstar, and her research spans an array of fields relating to innovation policy. She draws upon her PhD in nanotechnology, empirical research techniques, as well as a broad array of knowledge to be able to examine these questions of innovation policy. She's published in journals such as the Yale Law Review, University of Chicago Law Review, Nature Biotechnology, JAMA Internal Medicine, Journal of Empirical Legal Studies, and pretty much every other top law journal. Today, she's going to be talking about a critical issue in innovation policy and responses to COVID-19, and that's the concept of innovation policy pluralism. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to her.
Great, thanks so much, Jason, and thanks to everyone in the audience for making time for this today. So I want to start by noting that this talk is primarily based on work that I have done with Professor Daniel Hemmel, both about innovation policy in general and more recently in the context of COVID-19. I'll also draw on a new article on vaccines that I've written with a JD PhD student at Stanford, Claire Shui. And this talk also heavily builds on work with three of the prior speakers in this series, Professors Rachel Sachs, Jacob Shirkow, and Nicholson Price. We've been co-authoring regular blog posts on COVID-19 health and innovation law issues at Written Description blog, and we just published our 16th yesterday. So if you're interested in these issues, you should check that out. So there are tons of interesting legal questions here, obviously, since we're up to 16 blog posts on this. But the main thing that I want to focus on today is the connection between providing incentives for new innovations and promoting access to existing innovations. Because I think this has caused lots of confusion over the past few months. I think a number of you here are patent law academics, and many of us were probably taught and teach our students that the fundamental patent trade-off is between innovation incentives and access, where society puts up with the high prices on patented goods like pharmaceuticals to incentivize their development, but those patents also limit access. And in the political economy of pharma patent policy, patient advocates have focused on increasing access to medicines by limiting patent rights and encouraging competition from generic manufacturers. And this is exactly what many advocates and politicians are focused on right now. But what I hope to convince you of today is that this is a false choice, particularly for medical innovations, building on work that Daniel and I did in this 2019 article. And I think the biggest conceptual mistake that people keep making is not distinguishing between the out-of-pocket costs to patients that can pose barriers to access and the separate question of the financial incentive for developers. And I think the resulting focus on limiting patent rights and the concern about pharmaceutical firms profiting too much from the pandemic is both counterproductive and distracting from the more important health and innovation policy levers that we really need to be pulling to get out of this crisis. So these debates over patents and profits have happened for every kind of innovation related to COVID-19, including treatments and diagnostics. I'll focus primarily on the vaccine context. And just to give you some examples, this debate dates back to even before the first reported COVID death in the US at a congressional hearing in February, when HHS Secretary Alex Azar said that the government couldn't control vaccine prices because we need the private sector to invest. This commentary led to lots of outcry from progressive lawmakers, including Illinois Congresswoman Jan Schakowsky, who demanded that AZAR not allow any pharmaceutical manufacturer to set a price for a COVID-19 vaccine that would cause private insurers to raise premiums or further exacerbate the federal deficit. And there have been many examples since then, including MSF, Doctors Without Borders, saying that there should be no patents or profiteering on drugs, tests, or vaccines for COVID-19. There have been efforts by multiple countries, including Canada, Germany, and Israel, to override drug patents during the pandemic. And just this week, on Tuesday, the fact that at congressional hearings, Moderna, Merck, and Pfizer wouldn't commit to making no profit from COVID-19 vaccines drew concern from Democratic lawmakers and drew disapproving headlines. So these campaigns are all focused on the super important goal of making sure that vaccines are accessible even to the poorest patients. And I think this is particularly important in light of the inequities in who has been affected by this virus and the predictions from public health experts that we're unlikely to get back to a truly normal world unless there is widespread vaccination. And I think that the people behind these campaigns genuinely believe that a pandemic is a time when the incentive access trade-off should tip strongly toward access, that the cost to innovation incentives are low because anything that works is going to have a large market. It's a pandemic. There's huge reputational rewards. So there are plenty of incentives. Just look at all the firms that are currently working on COVID-19 vaccines. So I'll get to why there isn't actually an incentive access trade-off in a minute. But first, I wanted to say a bit about why I think this view of incentives is wrong. And there are really two different incentive problems here. So one is a long-term problem that no one invested enough in basic R&D for pandemic preparedness beforehand. As I recently wrote about in this article with Claire Shui, there are a bunch of economic reasons that market rewards for vaccine research are insufficient from a social welfare perspective. And for diseases with pandemic potential, the low expected profits stem not just from the economics, but also the politics. If a firm spends a lot of time investing in pandemic-related R&D, then once the pandemic hits, activists and politicians will demand that they give that R&D away for free or for very low cost. And this is all a case for supplementing market rewards with massive public funding, but governments haven't made sufficient investments in pandemic-related R&D, either through ex-ante funding or through commitments to reward success ex post. So firms have directed relatively little to R&D for vaccines in general, and particularly to the kind of vaccines that matter in a pandemic. And this is a problem where vaccines that might have been helpful in the current pandemic were killed off as insufficiently profitable years ago. And I think it's important to remember that this is unlikely to be the last pandemic of our lifetimes, and that what we do now for COVID-19 is going to affect how ready we are for the next pandemic. If demands to give everything away for free mean that no one makes any money on this, then we're going to have the same problem next time. But even if you aren't convinced that we should worry about the next pandemic, I think you should still care about incentives for COVID-19. Despite our late start, there are now lots of researchers working on early stage research and clinical trials for different treatments and vaccines. But we're really asking for unprecedented speed here. And I don't think enough people are thinking about what happens after a vaccine gets through clinical trials. So here's a nice graphical depiction from the New York Times comparing a typical vaccine development pipeline with all of the ways that that timeline might be compressed here. And I want to focus on this part, the building vaccine factories and manufacturing billions of doses and getting them into patients' arms. Building a vaccine manufacturing plant tailored for a particular vaccine typically takes about 5 years. And it isn't easy. I mean, that there is no nonprofit or government that can currently make vaccines at scale. All of the vaccine manufacturing know-how is currently concentrated in the private sector, mostly in just 4 firms. And these firms have understandably not been super enthusiastic about rushing to build enormously expensive facilities for vaccines that might not get through clinical trials, even with the government shouldering some of the costs, as Dr. Fauci has complained about here. I think there are some reasons to be concerned about this concentration of know-how in a few firms, and reason that having more government involvement in the commercialization side of biomedical R&D for vaccines and for other biomedical products would make sense. But right now we need to work with the infrastructure we have, which means that mobilizing the for-profit sector is critical. And that means that the public should want effective COVID-19 vaccines and treatments to be one of the more profitable things that firms could be working on right now. And a final point on incentives is that I think a lot of the discussion about firms getting too much profit from addressing COVID-19 fails to recognize the enormous cost of this disease. So I'm not going to do a detailed cost analysis here, but if you just try to ballpark the cost in the US, one crude lower bound would be the effect on GDP. So the World Bank estimates that US GDP in 2020 will be almost 8% lower than was projected before the pandemic hit, which comes to a cost of 1.6 trillion. Though, as my co-author Daniel Hemmel noted to me, that this is definitely an underestimate because GDP doesn't include human capital costs. And it's hard to estimate what is the social cost of the 60 million K through 12 students staying home from school, or the lost interactions with family and friends that we're all missing now. So one way to get some handle on these social costs is if you make some estimate of what is the average loss in the quality of a life year that Americans are experiencing from COVID-19. So if you say we're all 5% worse off and use a reasonable quality estimate, that comes to 3.3 trillion. And I suspect most Americans would say they're worse than 5% off. You could also get crude estimates if you look at the number of deaths that we've had in America and use the kind of numbers that federal agencies use when estimating the value of saving a life, which also gets you into the trillions. So the exact number here isn't the point. The point is that these are huge costs that will keep growing for every day that the pandemic continues. And so if you consider the government making a $1 billion investment in a vaccine that's in phase 1 trials, that investment's going to be worthwhile, even if there's only a small chance that it accelerates the speed with which the public gets that vaccine. So we don't need to know that the investment is going to increase the development speed. We just need to believe that there is some greater than 0 chance that it will. Okay, so if you're convinced that incentives matter, then it might seem that we face a tragic choice between having the incentives to get the drugs and vaccines we need and being able to afford them once they exist. But as I said in the beginning, this is a false dichotomy. Policymakers can separately choose how to incentivize new innovations and how to allocate access to those innovations. And having IP as one of the incentives doesn't mean that we need to use IP-based allocation. So this is the focus of Daniel's and my Yale Law Journal article last year, and we explained how these ideas apply to the current pandemic in a New York Times op-ed in April. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to unpack this innovation policy toolkit that we have to use non-IP allocation, even when we have market-based IP incentives. And I think this illustrates the many options that lawmakers have to resolve this tension between innovation and affordability by accomplishing both. So to help organize this discussion, I'll use the 2x2 framework that Daniel and I first developed in a 2013 Texas Law Review article. So in that article, we argued that one key dimension of innovation policy is the question of who decides the size of the transfer. Is it the government selecting reward sizes on a project by project basis, like for grants and prizes? Or does the government set relatively technology neutral ground rules under which reward sizes are set by the market, as with R&D tax incentives or patents? And then a second dimension is, when is the reward transferred? Is it early in the research process before the results are known, as with grants and tax incentives, or only ex post to successful projects, as with prizes and patents? And we explained in our 2013 article and others since then why no one of these policies is uniformly superior, and that the optimal innovation policy portfolio likely involves a combination of all of them. In the case of a COVID-19 vaccine, we think that there is a strong argument for using prizes. So challenge prizes for innovation have a long history, and they're effective in cases like this, where the government can define what we want and roughly how valuable it is, but not the best way to get there. As Daniel and I explained in a piece in Time in early March. So there are lots of design choices in how you might implement a prize for a COVID-19 vaccine. What Daniel and I advocate for is a prize per patient vaccinated, which we also call a market-based prize. And one way to do this is known as a advanced market commitment, or AMC, where the government commits in advance to paying a certain amount per vaccinated patient. This AMC mechanism was used recently in a partnership between some governments and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to incentivize a vaccine against pneumococcal disease, resulting in the immunization of over 180 million children. And one of the people who helped design that AMC is the Nobel Prize winning economist Michael Kramer. And he and some other prominent economists set forth a proposal for a similar per patient vaccinated reward in a New York Times piece in May. So I think Daniel and I are in good intellectual company here. And if you condition this prize on distributing the vaccine to patients at no cost, then this is a way to provide an enormous financial reward to vaccine manufacturers while allocating the vaccine through an open access mechanism. But suppose you are on the more market side of ex post incentives, and then thinking about patents, which is our typical market-based incentive for rewards for innovations after they've been developed. And there's a lot of reasons that it might make sense to offer rewards for innovations that have a high market demand that the government didn't anticipate in advance. But then what do we do if we want to allocate access to them in the middle of a pandemic, not using market incentives, market-based allocation, but using some open access mechanism? So there are a bunch of ways that the government can step in here to effectively give a IP-based reward to the producer, but distribute the goods for free, which you might broadly categorize as patent buyouts. Again, there are a bunch of design choices in how you might do this. So you can have a optional mechanism where the government goes to someone who has a valuable patent and says, we'll purchase these patent rights for X dollars, and then allow a competitive price, allow the market to distribute it. Or you can have what is effectively a compulsory license. If it's a government-funded invention, you can use provisions under the Bayh-Dole Act that allow the government to march in and take some control of how that patent is being licensed. There's also a provision 28 USC 1498 that a number of scholars have advocated using it allows the government to use any patent where the remedy is only for damages. So it's effectively a compulsory license. And the choice here between having a patent buyout versus using 1498, it tracks a lot of the debate over using property rules versus liability rules. I'm not going to get into the details of these mechanisms or that choice here. I'm happy to do that during the Q&A. The important point is that free access doesn't require having zero profits, that you can still provide the patent owner with the reward they would have gotten by distributing it through the market, even though you're choosing a different allocation mechanism. Another option here on the ex post rewards that's kind of between the government set and market set is basically what Rachel Sachs was talking about in her talk in this series last week, where you play with the amount the government is paying for procurement for knowledge goods. So here the government is buying at the patented price the patented good, and then distributing it to patients for free. And this happens in the US under programs like Medicare and Medicaid. And the government has, during the pandemic, stepped in and created programs for uninsured patients of providing reimbursement for their testing and treatment and care for COVID-19 at Medicare prices, and has also said that they will make a vaccine freely available. So it seems likely, as Rachel and Nicholson and Jake and I wrote in a blog post last week on vaccine policy, that any FDA approved vaccine is likely going to be free for Americans who want it, which doesn't mean that the seller of the vaccine won't get any profit from that. And as Rachel has written in a number of articles, this is also an important innovation policy lever in that the amount the government is offering to pay for these vaccines is going to, when it offers a larger amount, that's spurring greater investments in those technologies. So these are all options on the ex post side. On the ex ante side, there are lots of things that the government can spend through grants, national labs, the direct spending that it has invested in helping vaccine manufacturers build manufacturing capacity now to deal with the fact that if we want to be on track for having a vaccine next year, there have to be facilities built at risk before we know whether the clinical trials are effective. And there are also incentives that are being used on the ex ante market set side. There are general R&D tax incentives for the that apply to any kind of R&D, and specific R&D tax incentives for orphan drugs in the United States. The choice here between which of these we want to use is basically comes down to a question of whose crystal ball we trust, whether we think that the government or the market is going to do a better job of allocating this money to the projects that are most likely to be fruitful. But there are a number of reasons that using ex ante incentives may be more effective when there are binding capital constraints or extremely high risk, such that even a very large ex post reward isn't enough to spur sufficient investment. So this is the full innovation policy toolkit, and I hope that in thinking about all these policies, it illustrates the broader point that I've tried to focus on, which is that the incentives and allocation are two separate policy levers that policymakers can pull on when they're thinking about COVID-19. And we can achieve the goal of having widespread free access to testing and treatments and vaccines, as is important when we're dealing with a pandemic, while still providing strong incentives for innovation. So I will stop there, and I look forward to your questions.
Terrific. Thanks, Lisa. So if you'd like to ask questions, you can type them into the webinar Q&A. You can type them into chat, and we'll see them. I just want to put a one last shout out for the written description blog series on COVID-19 and innovation. If you're interested in this topic, I highly recommend that you check it out and read some of the wide array of posts that some of our speakers this series have written. So with that, I'm going to ask a question just to start out with, which is, does the availability of margin rights reduce the incentives for vaccine developers? I mean, is it, if this possibility exists, is that going to reduce the incentive? And should we care is another question.
It's a great question. And I think it depends on how margin rights are implemented. I mean, there has been very limited use of margin rights so far. And just to unpack this a little bit, because I sped over this during my talk. So margin rights, they only apply when you have public funding of something that leads to a patent. So much of the research that's happening at universities that's funded by the government, the university can patent that, but the government has some rights in those inventions that it mostly has not exercised. And this would only be effective if it is only patents that the government has some rights in that are applied to whatever this product we're interested in is, which is generally not the case. So like most pharmaceuticals, even if they start in a university and have some patents with government rights, they also have additional patents that are purely owned by the private sector. And so marching in with respect to some patents wouldn't be helpful there. But Jason, I take your broader point to be, if the government is exercising these rights, not just under the march-in provisions, but also under 1498, which is a similar compulsory license for patents on, for government use of patents, how will that affect incentives going forward? There's been relatively little use of 1498 in the pharmaceutical context. I think it will matter how the damages are calculated. So if it is used simply as a mechanism to calculate patent damages the way we roughly might in normal litigation, such that the pharmaceutical company is receiving roughly the same reward they would have, but it's being used to expand capacity, then it's not obvious that that would affect innovation incentives. If it's being used the way some scholars have advocated, of having royalties that are just a very small % of sales, which is much less than the pharmaceutical firms are typically expecting, then I think that would have an effect going forward. And I think we should be very cautious about only using these provisions or using the political threat of them to extract price concessions for things like pandemics or essential medicines. That, I mean, I think this creates a skew in the kinds of medicines that pharmaceutical firms are focusing on, where there's, it exacerbates the bias to be working on something like a lifestyle medicine where you're not going to have as much political outcry about high prices.
I have a question here, which is, how does central risk management fit with these options?
Can you define central risk management for me?
Can the person who wrote that question define central risk management? I'm going to go on to the next one, which is there a global coordination so that COVID vaccine and treatments and how these coordinations and agreements can be positively enforced?
Yeah, so there has not been global coordination. I mean, it depends exactly what you mean by that. Scientists have been working together to an unprecedented degree to try to get things to market more quickly than usual. But if you're asking about, is there some international policy on how we are incentivizing and allocating access to a vaccine, for the most part, no, which is how things work in innovation policy generally. And so there is a framework of intellectual property law treaties that all countries are required to offer patents to inventors from other countries. And Daniel and I have argued in other work that this treaty is a way for countries to spread the costs of the research that they're doing, such that if France ends up coming up with the coronavirus vaccine because of these IP treaties. Other countries that are benefiting from them will have to pay France and the firms there and the inventors for the benefit that they are getting through this IP framework. But then it's up to each country at the domestic level how they choose to implement their domestic policy, including whether they choose to negotiate with the patent holder in France to purchase patent rights or to purchase the drug directly from them and then allocate it for free domestically, or not. So I mean, that has been a matter of national choice. But I think the issues of once a vaccine is shown to be safe and effective and the first doses start rolling off the line, the question of how you allocate among different countries who gets access is going to be very important.
Okay, we have time for one more question here. This is from Bob Cook Deegan. Lisa, brilliant as usual. One observation, you land in the two options, government, Leviathan, or market. Sorry. One observation, you land in the two options, government, Leviathan, or market, in a drug market that's not really a market. That leaves out the insight of Elinor Ostrom and acolytes that when people talk and acknowledge common interests, they can build a commons. I get pluralism, but I don't get quite see what you actually think the government should do and that companies should do, especially regarding patents. Markets will not solve this. Government probably won't either. What will?
Thanks, Bob. That's a great question as usual, and I'd love to chat with you offline about this, but I'll offer a few thoughts here. I mean, in terms of what I think the government should do, I think they should use some of these various policy mechanisms to distribute vaccines and treatments and other things that are needed to address the pandemic as widely as possible, and that includes, I mean, like many of the problems that we've been talking about on the written description blog are things like the failure of many states to expand Medicaid, which is an important way that the government can enable access to patented inventions for poor patients, and so like that is a failure of innovation policy, we think, that doesn't have directly to do with patent law. I mean, so I think there is a lot of opportunity for bipartisan consensus and for patient advocates to work with pharmaceutical companies here. I mean, the failures of political economy are, to me, deeply frustrating in that I think there are ways to not just paint pharmaceutical companies as the enemy, but to try to make what is profitable also be what is good for society, rather than trying to eliminate profits completely. So I will stop there, but I would love to follow up with you on that, Bob.
Terrific. I have a few more comments and questions. I will forward those along, but with that, we are unfortunately out of time. So I'd like to thank Professor Ouellette one more time, thank all of you for joining us, and I hope that you'll be able to tune in this fall for our Fall Innovation Business and Law Center speaker series. So with that, I'll say goodbye.
Great, thanks, Jason.